Have you ever been truly, utterly alone, surrounded by a silence so profound it hums, only for that silence to be shattered by something utterly unexplainable, something outside, insistent and utterly chilling? Imagine being deep in the wilderness, miles from a paved road, the nearest neighbor a half-hour drive away on a good day. Now picture that isolation amplified by a sudden, brutal blizzard, a whiteout that swallows the world whole, trapping you in a small, wooden cabin. Everything feels safe, cozy even, until a sound starts, a soft, persistent tap, tap, tap on your window. This is the kind of story that makes you check your locks twice before going to bed. So before the story truly begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Post your city and local time in the comments. And if you've had a similar creepy encounter, share it below. Maybe your story will inspire the next one. Now, dim the lights, feel the air grow colder and try to ignore the shadows dancing at the corner of your eye. Let's dive together into tonight's nightmare. It was mid-January, a time when the northern woods truly claimed their silence. I had moved up to this cabin, a small, rustic place with a wood-burning stove and minimal cell service, a few months prior. I was an artist, a painter, and the solitude was exactly what I craved. The endless expanse of snow, the stark silhouettes of the pines against the winter sky, it was all inspiration. My days usually involved painting, reading by the fire, and long walks through the quiet, frozen landscape. I loved the feeling of being removed, untethered from the relentless hum of the city. I was prepared for winter, or so I thought. My pantry was stocked, the woodpile was high, and I had a generator for the inevitable power outages. I'd seen a few heavy snowfalls, but nothing truly extreme. Not yet. The day it started, the sky had been an unusually brilliant, almost painful blue. By early afternoon, though, a peculiar haze began to creep in from the north, blurring the sharp edges of the distant mountains. The air dropped about 20 degrees in an hour, and a subtle, almost imperceptible whisper started in the trees, growing quickly into a groan. I just brewed myself a fresh pot of coffee when the first flakes appeared, enormous, fluffy things that drifted down lazily. Within 30 minutes, it wasn't drifting anymore. It was coming down horizontally, thick and fast, a wall of white that annihilated visibility. The wind howled, a deep, mournful sound that reverberated through the cabin's timber frame. I knew immediately this wasn't just a regular snowfall. This was a proper blizzard, the kind that shuts down highways and strands people for days. I watched from my kitchen window as the world outside vanished, replaced by a furious, swirling vortex of snow and wind. The generator, a reliable beast, sputtered to life as the main power lines inevitably gave out. I piled more logs onto the fire, appreciating the warmth, a small island of comfort against the growing fury outside. I pulled out a book, made a simple dinner, and tried to settle in for what I knew would be a long night. Around midnight, maybe a little later, the wind reached a fever pitch. It screamed around the cabin, rattling the window panes as if an invisible giant were shaking the very foundations. The snow piled rapidly against the walls, already up to the sill of my living room window. I remember feeling a strange mix of awe and a nascent anxiety. It was wild, beautiful, and utterly isolating. I was completely cut off, perhaps for days. My cell service was gone, a dead zone in the whiteout. I lay in bed, listening to the cacophony, too wired to sleep. The roar of the wind, the creaks and groans of the old cabin, the rhythmic thrum of the generator outside, these were the only sounds for hours, until they weren't. It started subtly, barely audible above the storm's wail. A soft tap. I dismissed it almost instantly. Just a tree branch, I thought, heavy with snow, brushing against the glass. There were a few large oak trees close to the cabin, their bare branches often scraping against the siding in high winds. I rolled over, trying to find a comfortable position, but the sound persisted. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random, sporadic like a branch. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I sat up, my ears straining through the chaos of the storm. The sound seemed to be coming from the living room, specifically the large picture window that looked out onto the front of the property, now completely obscured by snow. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation was getting to me. I'd been alone for months, and sometimes the silence could warp perceptions, but the tapping continued. It was light, almost gentle, but relentless. I swung my legs out of bed, the floorboards cold beneath my feet. A shiver, not entirely from the chill, ran down my spine. I walked slowly towards the living room, my bare feet padding softly on the rug. The fire in the stove had dwindled to a low glow, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The only other light came from a few battery-powered lanterns I'd strategically placed. The wind was still ferocious, but as I got closer to the window, the tapping grew clearer. It wasn't the scrape of a branch. It was distinct, like a fingernail or perhaps a small stone against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. About every 2 seconds, I stood there, wrapped in an old woolen blanket, staring at the unseen world beyond the frosted pane. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe ice was building up in a peculiar way, or a piece of debris from the storm was caught in the wind. But the rhythm, that was what bothered me. It was too consistent, too intentional. I paused, holding my breath, hoping it would stop. It didn't. It continued, a chilling counterpoint to the blizzard's roar. My heart began to beat a little faster. There was no way a tree branch, even one weighted with snow, could tap with such measured cadence. I pressed my face close to the cold glass, trying to peer through the thick layer of condensation and the swirling snow outside. I could see absolutely nothing but white. The blizzard was a true whiteout, a phenomenon where visibility drops to near zero, making it impossible to distinguish ground from sky or anything in between. It was like looking into a roaring, featureless void. Still, the tapping continued, right at eye level. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe some animal, a desperate squirrel or a bird seeking shelter, had gotten too close and was trying to dislodge some ice. But then why the rhythm? Why not a frantic scratching? This was too calm, too patient. I stepped back from the window, pulling the blanket tighter around me. The thought struck me, cold and unsettling. What if it wasn't a tree branch or ice or an animal? What if it was someone? The idea was preposterous. No one would be out in this blizzard. It was deadly. The temperature was plummeting, probably well below freezing, and the wind chill would be lethal. I knew, as a grounding detail of the region, that exposure in such conditions could lead to severe hypothermia in minutes and death within an hour or two. Absolutely no one could survive out there for long. Yet, the tapping persisted. I walked over to the front door, double-checking the locks, though I knew they were already secured. The cabin was old but sturdy, built to withstand harsh winters. The windows weren't flimsy either. I went back to the living room, my gaze fixed on the window. The sound seemed to have moved slightly, now coming from a different section of the pane, a foot or two to the left. It was still the same soft tap, tap, tap. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. My mind raced, searching for any rational explanation, any way to make this normal. I even questioned my own sanity. Was the extreme isolation, coupled with the storm's intensity, finally eroding my composure? This was an element of ambiguity that gnawed at me. Was I hearing things? Was the wind playing tricks on my ears? I wanted to believe that desperately, but the tapping was undeniably there. I could feel it, almost a vibration through the floorboards. It had a peculiar, dry quality to it, unlike the wet slap of snow or the brittle crack of ice. It was a firm, distinct sound, like fingers on glass. I remembered a strange incident from a few years back, a detail that now felt like a dark foreshadowing. My former neighbor, an old hunter who lived even further out, had once told me about hearing strange knocking sounds during a similarly severe storm, dismissing them as the house settling, only to find peculiar handprints on his frosted windows the next morning, far too high for an animal. I'd laughed it off then, attributed it to old age and an overactive imagination. Now, that memory sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I moved closer to the window again, my breath fogging the glass even more. I lifted my hand, mirroring the tapping, and gently, almost imperceptibly, touched the glass in the spot where the sound emanated. I lifted my hand, mirroring the tapping, and gently, almost imperceptibly, touched the glass in the spot where the sound emanated. The cold seeped through my palm, and for a terrifying second I felt a faint vibration, not from the wind, but from the rhythm of the tap, tap, tap itself, a resonance directly beneath my fingers. My arm snapped back as if I'd touched something searing hot. My blood ran cold, and every hair on my body stood on end. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't ice. It wasn't a branch. There was something or someone on the other side of that window tapping, in the middle of a deadly blizzard, miles from anyone. My breath hitched in my throat. A silent scream caught somewhere between my chest and my lips. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My mind, usually so rational, reeled. Who could possibly be out there? Why would they be tapping? And why so calmly? The deliberate, unhurried cadence of the taps was the most terrifying thing of all. A person in distress trying to get help would be pounding, shouting, desperate. This was different. This was methodical. It was as if whatever was out there was simply announcing its presence, letting me know it was near. I scrambled to turn on every light I could find, not just the battery lanterns, but the old propane lamp in the kitchen, anything to push back the encroaching darkness. The cabin, which minutes before had felt like a refuge, now felt like a fragile glass box, exposed to an unseen, ominous presence. I didn't dare approach the window again, but I couldn't tear my eyes from it either. The tapping continued, unwavering. After a few minutes, the rhythm changed. Instead of the steady tap, 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 it became a series of quick, light raps, then a pause, then another series. It sounded like fingernails drumming impatiently. My mind raced, trying to process this new development. It was almost as if it knew I was watching and it was playing a game. The idea was absurd, terrifyingly so, but I couldn't shake it. My rational brain screamed explanations, the extreme cold affecting the glass, the wood of the house contracting, settling. But my gut, a primal, ancient part of me, knew better. It knew. I retreated to the small kitchen, snatching up the heaviest cast iron pan I owned. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was something. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, bathed in the flickering light of the propane lamp, straining my ears. The sound, if anything, had grown clearer. It wasn't just on the living room window anymore. I could hear it faintly coming from the small window above the sink. The tapping had moved. It wasn't confined to a single spot. It was moving around the cabin, testing the perimeter. Tap, tap, tap. Now from the front, now from the side. It was circling. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt like I was being hunted. But by what? A human, an animal. Neither scenario made sense. A human wouldn't survive out there, and an animal wouldn't tap politely on a window. Unless it wasn't an animal I recognized. My mind drifted to the old local legends, hushed tales told around campfires, stories of the winter folk or shadow walkers who roamed the deepest parts of the woods during the harshest storms, entities that preyed on the lost and isolated. I'd always dismissed them as folklore, old wives' tales meant to scare children. Now, in the terrifying isolation of the blizzard, with a rhythmic tapping echoing around my cabin, they didn't seem so far-fetched. I peeked through a small gap in the curtains of the kitchen window, my heart hammering, only pure white. The wind continued its mournful howl, but beneath it, I could discern the faint, persistent tapping, now definitely coming from the side of the house. It was lower this time, closer to the ground, almost at knee level. This new detail unnerved me further. If it was a person, why would they be tapping so low? Was it kneeling, huddled, or was it something else? An element of ambiguity settled deep in my bones. I didn't know if my mind was creating horrors to fill the void of isolation, or if something truly impossible was unfolding outside. The thought made me want to scream, but the sound felt too dangerous, too loud. I considered my options, limited as they were. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't leave. The storm was too violent, too deadly. I was trapped. All I could do was wait and listen and pray. The hours crawled by, each second stretched into an eternity. The tapping continued its relentless patrol around my cabin. Sometimes it was fast, sometimes slow. Sometimes it would stop for a few agonizing minutes, plunging me into a silence that was almost worse than the tapping, making me question if it had gone, or if it was just waiting, listening for me. Then it would start again, always from a different window, never staying in one place for long. It was playing with me, I realized, with a fresh wave of terror. It was toying with its prey. At one point, I heard a new sound, a faint scraping against the back wall near the small bedroom window. It wasn't tapping. It was a soft, methodical scrape, 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 like something being dragged lightly across the wood siding. My blood ran cold. Was it trying to get in, or was it just marking its territory? I imagined long skeletal fingers running along the rough cedar, seeking purchase. I imagined eyes, unseen in the whiteout, watching me through the windows, through the gaps around the door. I imagined a smile, too wide, too hungry. I forced myself to breathe, to push back the encroaching panic, to think. I looked around the small cabin, my sanctuary turned cage. The axe I used for splitting kindling was by the wood stove. It was heavy, sharp, better than a cast iron pan. I moved towards it, my movement slow and deliberate, trying not to make a sound. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. As I reached for the axe, the tapping at the front window resumed, louder this time, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was no longer gentle. It was firm, almost impatient. I froze, the axe handle cold in my sweaty palm. It was as if it knew exactly where I was, what I was doing. Then a new sound, distinct from the tapping and the blizzard's roar, a faint, high-pitched whimper. It was so faint, so unexpected, that I almost dismissed it as the wind, but it was too organic, too animalistic. My heart leaped. Had I been wrong? Was it a lost animal after all? A deer, perhaps, injured and seeking shelter? The thought of a suffering creature, out in this deadly storm, struck a chord of empathy despite my fear. What if it was just a desperate animal? But then the tapping resumed, still rhythmic, and the whimper seemed to blend into it, almost like an accompaniment, or a lure. A terrible thought struck me. What if the whimper wasn't from the thing outside, but of something it was holding? My mind recoiled from the implication. That was too dark, too monstrous. I told myself it was the wind, the blizzard playing tricks on my ears, on my exhausted, terrified mind. This was another grounding detail, I reminded myself. The wind during a severe storm can create strange, almost human-like sounds as it funnels through eaves or cracks. It was a known phenomenon. I tried to latch onto that, to find comfort in the scientific, but the tapping, ever-present, unwavering, contradicted every rational explanation. The high-pitched sound became more consistent, not a whimper anymore, but a low, sustained moan, like a child crying softly. My blood ran cold. This couldn't be the wind, and it definitely wasn't an animal. This was something else entirely. This was a direct, psychological assault. The anonymous experiences I was having were escalating from strange to utterly terrifying. The entity was now adding a new layer to its torment, something designed to break my resolve, to make me question everything. I clutched the axe tighter, my knuckles white. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever was outside, it wanted in, and it wasn't going to stop. I clutched the axe tighter, my knuckles white, the soft, mournful sound now blending with the incessant tapping and the blizzard's shriek, creating a symphony of dread. It wasn't just physical fear anymore. It was a profound psychological torment. The low, mournful sound, like a distant child's cry, felt like a deliberate strategy, designed to exploit my deepest human instincts, to make me doubt the danger, to open the door, even for a second. But my gut screamed at me to stay put. This wasn't a lost child. No one could survive out there for hours, let alone make such a steady, rhythmic sound. This was a trick, a lure, and the thing tapping knew exactly what it was doing. The tapping abruptly ceased. The sudden silence, broken only by the wind, was far more terrifying than the noise. My ears ached, straining for any sound. Had it gone? Was it waiting? Or was it moving to a different, more vulnerable spot? I held my breath, the axe heavy in my hand. Seconds stretched into minutes. The low moan also stopped. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. My eyes darted around the cabin, checking every window, every shadowed corner. The fire in the stove had long since dwindled to embers, and the cabin was growing colder. The generator's hum almost a comforting sound now, a sign of life, of technology in a world that had suddenly become ancient and terrifying. Then a new sound, not tapping, a slow, deliberate scrape just outside the front door. It sounded like something heavy and rough dragging along the wooden porch. Then a softer, almost scratching sound directly on the door itself, just below the peephole. It was methodical, like someone slowly scratching a pattern into the wood. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just at the windows anymore. It was at the door. It was trying to gain entry. I backed away slowly, putting the kitchen table between myself and the door, the axe raised defensively. What could scratch wood like that? Claws, something sharp. I could hear the faint thump, thump, thump of my own heart in my ears, louder than the storm. I peered through the tiny peephole, my eye pressed against the cold metal. All I could see was a blurry, snow-whipped vortex of white. The snow was piled high against the door, almost to the top. But then, for a split second, as the wind momentarily cleared a patch, I saw it. Not a face, not a creature, just a distinct dark shape pressed against the door, almost outlined by the falling snow. It was tall, impossibly tall and slender, like a shadowed column. And it seemed to be observing the door, its head tilted slightly. Another chilling detail. The top of the shape reached well above the peephole, which was already at my eye level of 6 feet. It was far too tall to be a person. I gasped, a small choked sound, and stumbled back, nearly dropping the axe. What I had just seen, even for a fleeting moment, defied logic, defied nature. My mind tried to reject it, to tell me it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the blizzard, an illusion caused by fear and exhaustion. But the image was burned into my mind, an impossibly tall, gaunt figure, darkly silhouetted against the raging white, almost leaning against my cabin door. My earlier element of ambiguity, my questioning of my own perception, vanished, replaced by a terrifying certainty. This was real, this was happening. Panic surged, raw and primal. I had to get out. Staying here was no longer an option. It was only a matter of time before whatever was outside found a way in. The cabin, once my refuge, was now my tomb. I scanned the room, desperate for an escape route. The windows were out of the question. They were sealed tight, and the snow was too deep outside anyway. The front door was compromised. That left the small back door in the utility room, which led to a tiny, enclosed porch, usually used for storing firewood. It was less exposed to the main force of the wind, and maybe, just maybe, the snow wasn't piled as high there. It was my only chance. I moved with a sudden, desperate energy, ignoring the persistent scratching at the front door. I grabbed my heaviest winter coat, thick gloves, and a wool hat, stuffing my emergency flashlight into a pocket. Practicality, even in the face of the impossible, kicked in. I thought about my car, buried somewhere under half a ton of snow, at least a quarter-mile down the unplowed driveway. It was useless. My only hope was to reach the old, abandoned ranger station about 2 miles further into the woods, a place I knew had an emergency radio. If I could just make it there, I might be able to call for help. It was a fool's errand in this blizzard, a near-suicidal attempt, but staying meant certain doom. As I reached the utility room, the scratching at the front door escalated into a frantic, splintering sound, as if something was actively trying to tear the wood apart. The soft moan returned, closer this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It knew I was moving. It knew I was trying to escape. The anonymous experiences I had endured for hours had now culminated into a horrifying chase. I threw open the back door to the porch, revealing a wall of snow nearly up to my chest. No time. I plunged into it, the freezing cold a shock to my system, a physical pain that momentarily pushed away the psychological terror. I wrestled the door shut behind me, not bothering to lock it, and then pushed through the snow on the porch, stumbling, fighting for every inch. The wind howled, a physical force that almost knocked me off my feet. The snow was blinding, stinging my exposed skin. I could barely see 2 feet in front of me. I pushed open the outer door of the porch and immediately sank into a drift that came up to my waist. The cold was instant, agonizing, but I kept moving, guided by pure adrenaline and the sound of the raging storm. My boots were filled with snow almost immediately. My lungs burned with the frigid air. I knew I couldn't last long out here. Exposure was a ticking clock. I heard it then, above the storm. A deep, resonant thump from the direction of the cabin. Then another closer. It was following me. My heart leaped into my throat. The tapping entity was now mobile. It was out there, in the deadly whiteout, pursuing me through the snow. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, or rather, floundered through the impossibly deep snow, my eyes fixed on the vague direction of the ranger station, a path I usually took in summer, now completely obliterated by the blizzard. The trees were ghostly shapes, distorted and terrifying in the swirling white. I could feel the cold seeping into my core, my hands and feet already numb. This was a true test of survival, one steeped in the impossible. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 20 minutes, I felt a peculiar pull, a shift in the air. The wind, while still fierce, seemed to lessen its direct assault. I realized I had stumbled into a slight hollow, a small ravine that offered a modicum of shelter. I paused, gasping for air, leaning against a snow-covered pine, my body screaming in protest. My vision was starting to blur, my thoughts becoming sluggish. Hypothermia, a dark foreshadowing from earlier, was setting in, but through the ringing in my ears, I heard it again. The tapping. It wasn't coming from behind me, from the direction of the cabin. It was coming from above, from the ridge of the hollow. I slowly looked up, my eyes barely able to focus through the snow and my growing fatigue. And there, outlined against the slightly less obscured sky, where the wind had momentarily swept the snow clear, I saw it again. The impossibly tall, slender, dark shape. It stood perfectly still, watching me from the ridge, a silent, menacing sentinel. The tapping, soft and rhythmic once more, seemed to emanate directly from it, a faint vibration that echoed in the silence between the gusts. It wasn't physical tapping, it was something else. Something about its posture, its stillness, suggested a profound alien intelligence. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was something that thrived in the impossible conditions of the storm, something that had simply been waiting for the right moment to emerge. I collapsed into the snow, my legs giving out, my mind reeling. It wasn't just trapped by a blizzard, I was trapped with something utterly alien and terrifying. I don't remember much after that, just a fading awareness of the cold, the tapping, and the dark silhouette standing sentinel on the ridge. I must have blacked out. The next thing I remember is waking up in a warm bed, the familiar smell of antiseptic in the air, a kindly nurse smiling down at me. They found me 2 days later, buried in a snowdrift near the abandoned ranger station, barely alive, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. They said it was a miracle I survived. They said the blizzard was one of the worst they'd seen in decades. They asked me what happened, but I couldn't tell them. How could I explain? How could I tell them about the tapping? About the impossible shape outlined against the storm? They never found any footprints around my cabin, not beyond my own desperate ones leading away into the drifts. The snow was too deep, they said, too thoroughly scoured by the wind. No signs of forced entry, just a few faint, almost imperceptible scratches on the front door, which they attributed to the storm's debris. I sold that cabin, of course. Couldn't bear to set foot in it again. But the experience, the chilling realization of what truly hides in the heart of what we deem wilderness, it never left me. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just so, or when a branch scrapes against my new apartment window, I hear it again. That soft, rhythmic tap, 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 and I wonder, was it just a solitary entity drawn to the isolation of the storm, an anomaly of the deep woods, or was it merely one of many, waiting patiently for the world to be swallowed by white, for the normal to be erased so they can emerge? I still check my locks multiple times before I go to bed. I still keep the lights on through the night if there's even a hint of snow, because some things once seen can never be unseen, and some sounds once heard echo forever in the silent corners of your mind. They don't just tap on windows, they tap on your sanity,